to introduce Captain Mike Hendy, who is my Chief Operating Officer. Mike?
Well, you can keep clapping. Just keep going. Good morning. I have the distinct privilege of introducing our next guest speaker. Mr. Jim Knotts is Chief Executive Officer of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, the VVMF, the nonprofit that built the wall in 1982. He's an Air Force veteran of the Persian Gulf War and a graduate of the Air Force Academy. He now leads the effort at VVMF to honor the service and sacrifices of Vietnam veterans, those who sacrificed all, those who served, and those who waited for the service members to return, as well as those who serve today. Preserving the legacy of service from generation to generation, from Vietnam to the Persian Gulf War to Iraq and Afghanistan, is Jim's personal commitment and the basis for the ongoing educational efforts of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Jim Knotts.
Well, thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of your event today. As many of you may know, yesterday was the 150th anniversary of General Lee's surrender at the end of the Civil War, which was the most divisive event in the first century of our nation's history. So I think it's fitting to remind you of what President Lincoln said as the end of the Civil War came about. He said, "With malice toward none and charity for all, let us bind the nation's wounds." He recognized that, like an individual, our nation has a spirit that could be wounded, that had been wounded by the divisive nature of the war. And that is the reason that I think these words encapsulate the importance of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial for our nation. The Vietnam War was arguably the most divisive event in the second century of our nation's history. The wall has helped to heal a generation and a nation. It is not merely a war memorial, but a memorial to and for those who served in the war, and really to everyone who lived through the era. Through the wall, we remember those who served, those who sacrificed, those who waited, and those who continue to serve today. In keeping with the spirit in which the wall was created, we teach all generations about military service so that they can show their appreciation for those who serve, because it was not always that way. When the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund was started in about 36 years ago in the spring of 1979, the world was a very different place. We had a basketball team here in town called the Washington Bullets, many of you may remember, and it was that year that they lost the NBA title championship to the Seattle Supersonics. Jimmy Carter was our president. The Cold War was nearly at its height, and the nation was in the grip of the Iran hostage crisis. In Kabul, Afghanistan, Muslim extremists kidnapped the U.S. ambassador, which foreshadowed events to come. However, with all of these events, the wounds of the Vietnam War remained untreated for the 2.7 million who served in and around Vietnam, and for any of those who had actively challenged the conflict back at home. Our nation was still divided, still wounded, even though our service members had left the field of battle. At that time, Army Corporal Jan Scruggs was in college studying the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder. He was learning about the psychological healing value for someone to be able to visit the gravesite of a family member or a friend, to be able to see and touch the name as an act of remembrance and a path to closure. He gathered a few other committed Vietnam veterans who shared in his vision of a national memorial on the Mall in Washington, D.C. as a way to honor the service of all and remember the 58,300 who made the ultimate sacrifice. Through a nationwide design competition and 1,400 design submissions, the 8 members of the selection committee unanimously chose the design we all know today. And the winner of the competition was a 22-year-old student from Yale University. Her name was Maya Lin, and interestingly enough, she was a first-generation American whose parents had fled China in 1949 around the time of the communist takeover. The design contest had only 4 requirements. First, it had to be a place of reflection and contemplation. Second, it had to fit in with its surroundings. Third, it could make no political statement about the war. And fourth, I think most importantly, it had to include the names of those who were listed as dead and missing. Now, Maya said she wanted to create a park within a park, a quiet and protected place unto itself, yet harmonious with the overall plan of Constitution Gardens. The walls have a mirror-like surface of polished black granite, reflecting the images of the surrounding trees, lawns, memorials, and of course, the visitors. The walls seem to stretch to the distance. To the east, pointing toward the Washington Monument, and to the west, pointing to the Lincoln Memorial, giving historical context to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. She actually described her thoughts as if a knife was plunged into the earth, into the heart of our nation, and opened a gash, a wound, exposing the final resting place of the 58,300 who gave their lives in Vietnam. Each name inscribed on the wall represents the life of a service member, a man or a woman with hopes and dreams from all walks of life and all parts of our nation. And while our nation has healed, there is still more to do. President Reagan said about Vietnam, "We've learned that young Americans must never again be sent to fight and die unless we're prepared to let them win." Now, as far as a lesson of Vietnam, I think that's a pretty good one. But as we enter the primary 10-year observance period to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Vietnam, I think there are a couple of others. And these lessons transcend across all generations who wear the uniform of our nation and put themselves into harm's way. First, reflecting upon the social upheaval in our country during the Vietnam era, we learned that our country should always support our men and women in uniform regardless of individual feelings about the war. I personally experienced that support as our country had learned that lesson and taken it to heart when I was in the Persian Gulf War and felt the support of the American people. Second, I think we should learn from the political decisions of the past, both good and bad. As citizens, we need to understand how decisions are made that ultimately will put our servicemen and women in harm's way, and the escalation of political tools available before resorting to military force. Third, I think we need to understand the information we consume through the news media because it can be so influential. We need to remain informed so each person can decide for themselves if or how they want to be engaged to hold our leaders responsible for their decisions. And fourth, we want people to always honor and respect service to our country by those who wear the uniform of the nation. So support our troops regardless of your feelings about the war. learn from political decisions, good and bad, remain informed, and honor and respect military service. I think those are fairly clear, and I truly believe in my heart that those lessons transcend every generation who wears a uniform. In conclusion, I want to share a recent experience I had where someone asked who would benefit from a visit to the wall. Now obviously, I think every American would benefit from a visit to the wall. During the daylight hours, the experience is sobering and thought-provoking. But there is another group that I think should visit at night, when it is dark and quiet and lonely. And those are our nation's leaders. As I face the wall, I look to the right, which is facing the east, and I see the Capitol, where Congress legislates and appropriates for our military. I start looking toward the north and see the White House, and I think of the President and his advisors, who ultimately make that decision that it is time to no longer pursue peaceful and diplomatic paths, but to employ force and put Americans in harm's way. I continue sweeping to the west, and I see the State Department, those who are responsible for pursuing those avenues of peace short of military force. And finally, to the west, I look at the Pentagon, our military leaders who are training our military and fighting our wars, who bear that responsibility. These are the people, I feel, must gaze upon the wall and think of the sacrifice each person made as they contemplate the sacrifices they're asking of our newest generation of men and women in uniform. The 58,000 will call to them and speak to them of service, sacrifice, ideals larger than themselves. Their plea will always be to remember the tremendous power and awesome responsibility they bear in each and every decision. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. And for all of you who have worn the uniform of our nation, I salute you.
We do have microphones if there's any questions for Mr. Knotts.
Thank you, Jim. That was wonderful. I've never really heard the description of the wall like that before, and I think it touched all of us. There is a poster that's out that of an individual with their hand on the wall that is everywhere. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that came about?
Well, there are a lot of iconic images of the wall, of the 3 service member statue, and of the Women's Memorial that constitute the memorial site. That is a rendering by a Vietnam veteran, and I think it fully captures the power of the design of the wall and its ability to aid the healing. You heard in my comments how it's polished granite, and it was meant to be reflective, a reflective surface like a mirror, to reflect the surrounding and, of course, the images of the visitors. That was by design, and Maya Lin said that she wanted people to be able to put themselves in the place of those names on the wall who were their comrades, to be able to find the name. And for those who don't know, the names are listed in a somewhat unusual way. It actually starts right in the middle, on the right side at the top. And the names are listed chronologically based on the date of death. And then on a particular day, alphabetical. And one of the reasons she decided to list the names in that way is that so that those who died together could remain together forever. And so a service member, a Vietnam veteran who might have lost their comrades in a particular battle could go and find those names and through that reflection be with them again. If I can, I want to say one more thing. General Salisbury was talking about the best of times and the support that our military during the deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan has enjoyed. But I can tell you, I have seen it firsthand, and that honor and respect for their service is a direct result of Vietnam veterans saying we will never again let our generation go to war without the honor and respect that they deserve. I recently attended a national board meeting at the Vietnam Veterans Association, and it was interesting to me that while they did talk about the needs of our Vietnam veterans, even more of the conversation was about what their chapters, their members, the Vietnam veterans around the country were doing to actively support this generation of veterans. And if there's any legacy of Vietnam, it's not about the geopolitics and stuff like that. That impacts our country every day, and that's important. But what's more important is the people, okay? And the commitment of our Vietnam veterans is the same as the commitment of every generation that wears a uniform. And that is, we know that we owe a debt to those who came before us, served before us. But we also owe a debt to the next generation. And supporting one generation of service to another really, I think, embodies the term legacy of service. And it is inspiring to me to see that that is the legacy of Vietnam 50 years later, that generation is paying it forward to the next generation, and that they have ensured the most important lesson, that we should support our service members regardless of what we think about the war, that is actually taking place, and one generation is supporting another. And even if the war was actually fought by less than 0.5% of our nation's population, those that didn't serve in the military have supported our troops in lots of different ways. If nothing more, they've supported them philanthropically so that those 40,000 organizations could provide a range of services, as imperfect as it may be, a range of services that never was available to you all during and after the war. So that is the legacy that I look to. That is the legacy I want future generations to learn about, what it means to serve in uniform and their role in supporting our troops. Yes, sir.
Good morning and thank you. I'm Mel Williams, and I'm the inaugural Associate Provost for Military and Veterans Affairs at the George Washington University. And it was purposeful that I went to academia, the education space. You talked about the ability to influence our political leaders and military leaders to remind them of military service and going there at night, etc. At GW, we're doing that for the traditional students, the 18-year-olds, to be in the classroom with those who have served in the military, and it's going very well. And we sponsor a lot of events, and one is where we have a march where we go around all the memorials in Washington, D.C. to include the wall, and there are veteran students as well as traditional students, and they are learning. And so the question I have is, do you know of any national level sponsored program to purposefully influence the students in our country, where they go around and to the wall as well as the other memorials to address that widening gap between the less than 1% and the 99%?
Unfortunately, I don't, but I think there are a lot of programs on campuses like yours where you do have a lot of veterans returning to the classroom. And I think that is instructive in and of itself. But I do know that there are high schools and colleges that are teaching courses where Vietnam is the focal point. It may be history classes, it may be social sciences classes, but they're looking at Vietnam, looking at the lessons of it and how it relates to things we're learning today. I will tell you about one project that we are in the midst of, and that is about 11 years ago, we received legislative permission to build a permanent education center at the wall. So those who have been there, if you're on Constitution and you're looking south, the wall is to your left, the Lincoln Memorial is to your right. There's a road that cuts across, and there's a field, an empty field where they play soccer and such, and there's I think a hot dog stand for the Park Service. That is where we are raising the money to build a permanent education center. Now, the primary exhibits inside will be a wall of faces. And I mention this because we need your help on this. We're in the process of collecting a photo for every one of the 58,300 names that's on the wall. Luckily, we just recently went over the 40,000 mark, so we have just over 18,000 to go. But I ask you to go on our website and look up someone you know and see if we have their photo. And if not, take it as your project to help find a photo so we can have a photo for every name that's on the wall. So we're going to have literally a wall of faces, and it will change over time. We even have the capability to put up special photos on certain days, you know, like the Navy birthday, we'll be able to put up just sailors, and the Marine Corps birthday, we'll put up Marines, and of course we'll keep a bank of Air Force photos up all the time. But that'll be one exhibit to really drive home the fact that it's not just a name, it's actually a person with hopes and dreams that is no longer there. And that's a lasting wound that we'll never be able to heal. The other is, over the years, there have been over 400,000 items left at the wall. And the Park Service collects all of those, and they have them in an archive over in Landover, Maryland. And I have a full-time curator that works there to curate that collection. And in the Education Center, we're hoping to have between 4,000 and 6,000 items that have been left at the wall. And they're pretty amazing. I think General Salisbury also mentioned McNamara's Mea Culpa. One of my favorite items that we've identified that will go in one of the special display cases is a copy of that book with 9 holes blown in it. And there is a note that accompanies it from a Marine who basically said, yeah, you bastard, we fought, we bled, we died. I was shot 9 times, so 9 bullets ought to be enough for you. And he blew 9 holes in the book. So we certainly don't have wilting flowers who are shy about expressing their opinions. So that's one opinion, but you can imagine, you've all heard stories about the kinds of things that are there. Incredibly evocative and powerful, and helps you really understand the human cost of war. Finally will be a timeline of Vietnam, and importantly, it's not just the Vietnam War, it's actually the Vietnam era, because we want to represent that divisiveness that took place in our country that affected even those back at home, and that the wall has helped to heal. And the educational content we'll be able to present will be based on the 4 takeaway lessons that I mentioned earlier. And I think this center is important because Vietnam will be the focal point of all of the material in the Education Center, but everything we do there is going to be linked to those who are currently serving and that legacy of service across generations. So I don't know of an organized educational activity as you described, but I hope that the Education Center, as we raise the money for it, will be able to be that, not only for Vietnam, but for future generations as well, always looking at the service of those who came before and equating it to those who were serving at that time. Sure. Sorry, it was a bit of a long answer. I'm going to get the hook here, but thank you so much for your attention. Thanks for Vinson Hall for putting on this symposium, and thanks for letting me be a part of it.
Okay, you heard it here first. The first shot across the bow about an Air Force comment over the other services has started. So the inter-service rivalry can begin, and the banter should start at the break that we're about to take. Thanks again, Mr. Knotts. That was a great presentation. We appreciate that. I have had the unfortunate opportunity to attend a couple services at Arlington for some shipmates. And if you have attended one of those in the last 10 years or so, off in the distance to not be a part of the funeral, the ceremony, is usually a group of 5 or 6 individuals, all dressed in leather, sporting the Harley Davidson motorcycle clubs, and they are at every funeral. And when you go talk to them, 90% of them are Vietnam era colleagues, and they're there just to respect the warrior and pay it forward and let us forget. And that is one thing I will not forget. Okay, we are going to take a 10-minute break so we can get set up for our first panel presentation. So I have 10:35 by my clock, so if we could be back here and seated at 10:45, and we will begin again. Thank you very much.